What happens when a firebrand preacher, a man with a voice that could shake the rust off a barn, spits on a sacred icon in front of hundreds of people? And what happens when that same man, just months later, lays dying in a sterile hospital bed, begging that very icon for mercy? This isn't fiction. This is the true story of a man who waged a war on faith, only to find salvation in the very thing he rejected. In the heart of southern Texas, in a town just outside Corpus Christi, two spiritual worlds quietly collided. One was rooted in centuries of tradition, in the tender, whispered prayers to the Virgin Mary. The other was born of revival tents, bold sermons, and a fierce, unwavering rejection of all icons. This was a place where roadside taco stands shared corners with Baptist churches and Catholic missions, where a cultural and spiritual fault line ran straight through the community, and Reverend Matthew Blake stood at the epicenter of that collision. At 54, with piercing blue eyes, silvering hair, slicked back, and a voice that could command a crowd of thousands, Matthew had become a household name in evangelical circles. His sermons, sharp as razors, were streamed across half the state. His message was simple, stark, and absolute. Mary cannot save you. The saints cannot hear you. Only Jesus. Matthew led the True Faith Revival Church, a congregation that had outgrown 2 buildings in 5 years. To his followers, many of them working-class Anglos and Latinos who had converted from Catholicism, he was a prophet. He was a man who spoke the truth, a man who had freed them from what he called the shackles of tradition. But to the local Catholic community, he was something else entirely. Sister Alma Delgado, a lifelong member of St. Rosa de Lima Catholic Parish, had watched his ministry grow with a weary heart. It wasn't just theology, she once whispered to a reporter, her hands twisting the beads of her rosary. It was our family, our culture. He called our mothers idolaters for lighting a candle to the Virgin. For these families, the Virgin of Guadalupe was more than a religious figure. She was La Virgencita, the abuelita's whisper at bedtime, the candle on the dashboard during a storm, the reason some women walk barefoot in December processions through the cold streets. She was the matriarch of their faith, a mother figure who had held generations in her gaze. To Matthew Blake, however, she was a lie, a cultural stronghold, a spiritual virus, as he often called it, that had wrapped itself around generations of Latino families, holding them hostage to superstition. He saw his mission as cleansing the community from what he believed was idolatry disguised as tradition. So each year on the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Matthew and his flock would line the procession route. Their signs read, "Statues can't save you," and "Worship Jesus, not idols." They prayed aloud in English while the Catholic hymns floated through the Texas dusk in Spanish, a dissonant chorus of competing faiths. But it wasn't until December 2013 that the tension finally erupted. The sun was setting on a dusty procession, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. An elderly woman named Doña Alda Cruz, a great-grandmother whose face was a roadmap of a long life, walked barefoot. Her hands were clasped around a small, framed image of the Virgin. Her lips trembled as she whispered prayers for her grandson, a boy diagnosed with leukemia. As she passed, Matthew stood at the edge of the route, his Bible in one hand, a megaphone in the other. He looked tired but electric, a man convinced of his own righteousness. Then in front of a stunned crowd, Matthew took one step forward. He didn't scream, but his voice was loud enough for hundreds to hear. "She doesn't exist," he yelled. "You're bowing to painted lies." And then he did something no one expected. He spat, not at the woman, but at the image in her hands. A collective gasp swept through the street. Phones shot up, capturing the moment. But Doña Alda did not react with anger. She simply knelt on the pavement and whispered, her voice barely a breath, "Forgive him, little Virgin. He doesn't know what he's doing." That moment, the spit, the scream, the prayer, would become the viral clip that shook the internet. By morning, it had over 4 million views. To outsiders, it was just another religious controversy. To Corpus Christi, it was war. Matthew claimed it was divine conviction. The Catholics called it sacrilege. News vans parked outside both churches. The mayor issued a plea for unity. Faith lines, once blurred by shared family ties and neighborly potlucks, hardened like stone. But deep inside a hospital room just months later, that same preacher, the man who had hurled insults at the Queen of Heaven, would find himself whispering her name in pain, desperate not for a miracle, but for peace. And that's where this story truly begins. Long before Reverend Matthew Blake became the face of anti-Catholic rhetoric in South Texas, he was just Matty, a quiet boy with a cowlick and a shy smile, growing up in a modest duplex on 6th Street, just 2 blocks from the bell tower of San Rosa de Lima Catholic Parish. His mother, Dolores Blake, was a second-generation Mexican-American who clung tightly to her rosary beads and her faith. Every night, without fail, she would light a candle in front of a small frame print of the Virgin of Guadalupe above the fireplace. La Virgencita always listens, she'd whisper to Matthew before bed, even when no one else does. And Matthew believed her. As a boy, he prayed earnestly to the Virgin and to God, for good grades, for his dad to stop drinking, for the arguing in the house to stop, and most of all, for his mother's health to improve. Dolores had been sick for years with what the doctors called an undiagnosed autoimmune condition. It left her tired and pain, and eventually bedridden. But she never stopped praying. Every morning, despite the weakness in her limbs, she would reach for that rosary and murmur Hail Marys through her cracked, dry lips. Matthew was 13 the night she died. The candle had burned low. The house was silent except for the beep of her heart monitor. When it flatlined, Matthew fell to his knees in front of the image of the Virgin and waited. He waited for something, a miracle, a sign, anything. But nothing came. No whisper, no warmth, no movement in the candlelight. Only silence. At the funeral, he refused to speak. At the burial, he refused to pray. Where was she when Mom needed her? He muttered when no one was listening. Where was God? Over the next few years, something hardened inside him. He still went to Mass out of obligation to his grandmother, Abuela Celia, who had taken him in. But his heart was no longer there. He watched with growing resentment as she kissed her medallion of Mary and whispered novenas into the morning light. He started skipping church. First once a month, then completely. Then came the flyer. It was left tucked into the screen door one humid afternoon when he was 17. A bold title in crimson ink screamed, "Jesus saves alone." He tossed it in the trash and then, for some reason he couldn't explain, pulled it back out. That night, for the first time, he read the Bible without Catholic eyes. He lingered on the words in the Gospel of John, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." That was the spark. What followed was a wildfire. By 23, Matthew had joined a small, non-denominational Bible church on the outskirts of town. Within months, he was preaching youth sermons. By 28, he had started True Faith Revival out of a borrowed mechanic's garage. His sermons weren't just about salvation. They were about purification. He saw his calling as cleansing the community from what he now believed was idolatry, disguised as tradition. But the most defining act of his early ministry came one Sunday afternoon. He was 29. Abuela had invited him for lunch after Mass. She was frail but cheerful, setting out tortillas and tamales like it was Christmas. After the meal, she returned to her altar, the same one that had once belonged to Dolores. Matthew stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her kneel. Then something snapped. He walked in, grabbed the framed image of the Virgin, and without a word hurled it into the backyard where it shattered against the fence. His grandmother screamed, "It's just glass and paper," he yelled. "God doesn't live in icons." Celia didn't reply. She just closed her eyes, whispered a prayer, and never spoke to him again. She died 2 years later. He didn't attend the funeral. Years passed. The altar was gone. The Virgin was gone. Only the anger remained, justified, baptized in Scripture, and polished for public display. But for those who knew Matthew before the pulpit, especially Sister Alma, who had taught him catechism, they remembered a boy who once believed in miracles. He used to cry during the Christmas Mass, she once said. Something broke inside him after his mother died, and instead of healing, he built a ministry out of the pieces. By 2010, the name Reverend Matthew Blake had become more than a local preacher. It had become a brand. What started as a group of 12 believers crammed into a cluttered auto garage had exploded into a fully functioning congregation known as True Faith Revival Church. It was housed in a repurposed warehouse with a glowing neon sign that read simply, "Jesus saves, Mary doesn't." To his critics, it was offensive. To his followers, it was truth finally spoken aloud. Sundays became events. Rows of plastic chairs were filled with former Catholics, born-again believers, recovering addicts, single mothers, and teenage runaways. They came not just to hear about grace, but to hear a war declared on everything that had once confused or wounded them. Matthew stood on the stage, not behind a pulpit, but on a steel platform, in rolled-up sleeves and work boots. His Bible was worn, but his voice was sharp. His tone wasn't tender. It was tactical. Statues don't bleed for you. Rosaries don't redeem you. Saints don't hear you. Only Christ, only the cross. Then came the fire sermons. He began targeting one symbol more than any other, the Virgin of Guadalupe. To Matthew, she wasn't just a false idol. She was a cultural stronghold, a spiritual virus that had held generations hostage to superstition. He devoted entire sermon series to dismantling Marian theology with slides, quotes, and historical deconstruction. Every Sunday was another strike against the Queen of Heaven. Mary was blessed, yes, he shouted in a sermon that later circulated online. But she's not your mediator. She's not your mother. She's not divine. And she is not listening. The church grew. The message spread. One of his earliest converts, Carmen Velasquez, remembered the moment she left the Catholic Church. Her husband had been an alcoholic for nearly a decade. She had prayed novenas to Mary for years. "Nothing changed," she said during a testimony night. "But the moment I gave my life to Christ alone, no statues, no saints, he got clean. It wasn't Mary, it was Jesus." Stories like Carmen's were Matthew's fuel. They became part of a larger narrative. Mary is holding you back. Christ sets you free. But not everyone was converted. Across town, Father Anthony Delgado at St. Rosa de Lima parish watched it all unfold with weary eyes. "He's not just attacking doctrine," he once told a diocesan reporter. "He's attacking our families, our traditions, our mothers." The tension, once subtle, began to stretch into the streets. During the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Corpus Christi's Latino neighborhoods would erupt in celebration. Marching bands, candlelit processions, barefoot pilgrims, girls in white dresses walking with framed images of the Virgin held high. And in the shadow of those traditions stood Matthew Blake. He began organizing what he called freedom walks, counter marches during Catholic feast days. His congregation would dress in plain clothes, carrying signs that read, "Mary can't hear you," and "No queen in heaven but Christ the King." They weren't violent. They didn't yell. But their presence was disruptive, intentional, designed to challenge, not just to witness. And then came December 12th, 2013, a day that would change everything. The Guadalupana procession that year was the largest Corpus had seen in over a decade. Streets were closed. Police escorted the faithful as they moved through the city, chanting hymns and lighting candles. An 80-year-old woman, Doña Alda Cruz, barefoot, carried a small image of the Virgin against her chest. Her grandson had been diagnosed with leukemia. She whispered to Mary with each step, "Bring him peace, Virgencita, just peace." That's when she saw them. A group of nearly 50 members of True Faith Revival stood along the sidewalk. Matthew was at the center, Bible clutched in one hand. He looked tired but electric. As Alda passed, he stepped forward and raised his voice, loud enough for hundreds to hear. "That Virgin won't save your grandson. She doesn't exist." Then he did something no one expected. He spat, not on the woman, but at the image in her hands. The sound was soft, but the moment was explosive. Gasps, tears, phones raised to record. Someone shouted, "Blasphemy!" Another yelled, "Call the police!" But Doña Alda said nothing. She simply knelt right there on the pavement and whispered, "Forgive him, Holy Mother. He doesn't know what he's doing." Within hours, the video was online. Within days, it had over 4 million views. To some, it was proof of prophetic boldness. To others, a vile act of religious hatred. Even many Protestant leaders across the state distanced themselves from the act. But for Matthew, it was a holy stand. He was just being honest, said Eric Salazar, a deacon in the church. Truth offends, and Jesus said it would. But what no one, not even Matthew, knew at the time was that the moment he spat at Mary would become the first stone on a road that would break his body and remake his soul. 6 months after the infamous December procession, Reverend Matthew Blake stood once again before his congregation. But something was off. The fire in his voice flickered. He stumbled on a Bible verse he'd quoted 100 times before. His hand trembled as he turned the page. For a moment, he seemed lost. Then he blinked, chuckled softly, and pushed through. Most assumed it was exhaustion. After all, the church had doubled in size since the video went viral. New locations were opening across South Texas. Pastors from other states were calling him the Paul Revere of modern Reformation. But at home, his wife Patricia saw what others didn't. The headaches, the long silences, the sudden flashes of anger over minor things. Once he forgot the name of a deacon he'd worked with for over a decade. Another time, she found him standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at the wall, holding a spoon like it was a microphone. "I'm just tired," he kept saying. "It's spiritual warfare, nothing more." But then came the Sunday when his body gave out. He was mid-sermon, walking the edge of the stage, when he gripped his head and collapsed right in front of 600 people. A gasp moved through the church like a wave. Screams, rushing feet. Someone called 911. Others knelt in prayer. Patricia ran to the pulpit as her husband lay motionless, his lips twitching, his eyes wide and unfocused. At the Corpus Christi Medical Center, scans were taken, blood was drawn, and 3 days of silence followed. On the fourth day, Dr. Henry Sandoval, a neurologist with 30 years of experience, entered the room holding a clipboard and wearing a face that had delivered bad news before. "Mr. Blake," he began carefully, "you have a tumor. It's called glioblastoma multiforme. It's one of the most aggressive brain cancers we know. It's located in your left frontal lobe." Matthew didn't flinch. He just stared, eyes unreadable. Patricia gasped. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "It means without treatment, you may have 3 months. With surgery, chemo, and radiation, we could push that to 12, maybe 15. But I need to be honest. The 5-year survival rate is under 5%. Silence. A heavy, sacred silence. Later that night, while the city buzzed with its usual chaos, inside a dim hospital room, a man who had spent 2 decades declaring that Jesus heals all who believe stared into the ceiling tiles and felt utterly abandoned. "Why now?" he whispered. He had preached revival in dozens of churches, rebuked idolatry in city streets, cast out addiction in families. He had stood firm when others called him a fanatic. He had spat at Mary and proclaimed Christ without apology. So why now, when the ministry was thriving, when hundreds hung on his every word? Was his body crumbling? That night when Patricia returned from the chapel, she found him weeping, not from pain, but from confusion. "I spent my life yelling for God," he said, his voice raw. "And now he won't answer." She held his hand, unsure whether to offer scripture or silence. "Maybe," she finally said, "this isn't punishment. Maybe it's a door." "A door to what?" he muttered. "A door to see what happens when you stop shouting and start listening." At church, the news spread fast. Prayer chains lit up. Fasting began. Pastors across Texas called for 24-hour intercession. On live streams, Patricia asked for healing miracles. She quoted James 5:15. "And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well." But Matthew said nothing. He smiled politely during visits, nodded through prayers. But at night, when the machines beeped and morphine dulled the fire in his skull, he wasn't praying for healing. He was praying for answers. And so the man who once shouted at statues began whispering in the dark, not for a cure, but for a God who might still be listening. The hospital lights never truly went out. Even at 3 a.m., they hummed faintly through the blinds, casting a sterile glow over Reverend Matthew Blake's gaunt, sweat-soaked face. The morphine dulled the pain, but not the questions. And it was in those long, merciless nights when the prayers had stopped coming from his lips and started echoing only in his mind that the ghosts began to return. Not demons, but memories. The image that haunted him most wasn't the tumor on the MRI, but his grandmother Celia kneeling at her makeshift altar, whispering Ave Marias with a peace that now felt unreachable. He had hated that peace once. He had torn her virgin from the wall and shattered it on the concrete. He'd called her foolish, blind, lost. And now he lay in a hospital bed, whispering to a God he could no longer feel. Patricia noticed the change first, not in his body, which had already been breaking, but in his tone. He wasn't angry anymore, she later recalled, just hollow, like all the fire had turned to smoke. One night, while spooning ice chips into his mouth he could barely swallow, she asked gently, "What are you thinking about?" Matthew stared out the window. The city beyond was quiet. "Do you remember," he rasped, "when I smashed Abuela's altar?" Patricia hesitated. "I do." "I said it was just clay and paint," he whispered, "but she cried like I'd broken a piece of her soul. And maybe I did." That confession cracked something deeper than any sermon he had ever preached. Over the next few days, Matthew spoke less about miracles and more about regrets. He remembered Refugio, the Catholic mother whose son Roberto he had turned against her. He remembered Carmen, the woman who had denounced Mary with such passion because he had taught her to. He remembered the day he spat toward that old woman's image of the Virgin and told her God wasn't listening. What if he had been wrong? What if the people he dismissed as idolaters had simply found God through a different window? That thought shook him more than the tumor. Because if that were true, if the Virgin was not an enemy but a mother to the broken, then he had spent his life declaring war on love itself. Nurse Angela Brooks, who had worked in hospice for over a decade, noticed how patients nearing death often spoke in loops. The same faces, the same phrases over and over. But Matthew Blake didn't loop. He unraveled. One morning as she changed his IV bag, she heard him whisper something that stopped her cold. "Virgencita," he said, barely a sound. "Did you ever pray for me?" Angela, a devout Catholic herself, stood still. She didn't speak. She just watched as a man who once claimed Mary was nothing more than a myth, wept silently into his pillow. His congregation didn't know. They still gathered in shifts, praying loudly in the hospital chapel, declaring healing, fasting for breakthrough. They wanted the Matthew Blake who cast out demons, who stood at pulpits and pointed fingers. But that man was gone. In his place was a dying preacher staring into his own legacy like a courtroom transcript. "I taught people to hate," he told Patricia one night, "and I wrapped it in scripture." She didn't argue. She didn't say he hadn't. She simply held his hand and whispered, "Maybe now you get to teach them something else." The tumor was growing. The scans confirmed it. But something else was growing too. A question not about God's existence, but about his voice and whether it sometimes came through people we were too proud to listen to. For Matthew Blake, the firebrand who once screamed that Mary was a lie, the real torment wasn't the cancer. It was the possibility that the woman he'd hated most had been quietly loving him all along. And maybe, just maybe, she still was. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Refugio Mendoza knocked on the hospital room door. The halls were quiet, eerily so. Nurses moved like ghosts. Machines beeped in a dull rhythm. Outside, a pale Texas sun poured through the tinted glass. Inside, Reverend Matthew Blake lay sunk into white sheets. Thinner now, smaller than his reputation. Patricia opened the door. The woman standing there was barely 5 feet tall, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her brown hands folded around a small plastic rosary. She wore a simple beige shawl and held a familiar object in the crook of her arm, a framed image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, slightly faded at the edges. "My name is Refugio," she said softly. I'd like to see the pastor." Patricia hesitated. She knew who this was. Refugio Mendoza, the woman whose son Roberto had once smashed her nativity set after joining Matthew's church. The woman who had collapsed with a heart attack the night her family fell apart. The woman whose name had come up in Matthew's bedside confessions more than once. Still, Patricia stepped aside. Matthew's eyes fluttered open as Refugio entered. He blinked twice, his vision blurred from chemo, but he knew her. It had been years, yet he remembered her face, not from a peaceful conversation, but from a single moment across a picket line, her hand clutching her son's wrist, pulling him away from a protest where Matthew had denounced the Virgin. Now she was standing at the foot of his bed. "Senora Mendoza," he rasped. She didn't let him finish. "I'm not here for apologies, Pastor," she said gently. "I'm here because I heard you were dying, and I wanted you to know. I've been praying for you." The room held its breath. Matthew blinked again. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything, after what I taught your son to do, why would you pray for me?" Refugio stepped closer and placed the small image on his bedside table. Then she sat. "Because," she said, "you are still someone's son, and someone's husband, and someone who once believed he was doing the right thing. And because I believe in a God who never stops hoping you will come home." Matthew's lips quivered. He turned his face away. "I destroyed your peace." "No," she said firmly. "You didn't. You tried. But peace rooted in love survives even the loudest hatred." He looked at the image now beside him, her eyes downcast, hands folded, cloak of stars. "I taught hundreds to mock that face," he whispered. Refugio reached over and gently placed her palm on the back of his hand. "And I forgive you." There were no trumpets, no dramatic music, only the hum of the oxygen machine and the soft murmur of passing nurses. But something cracked in that room. A wall that had been built from years of pride, sermons, theology, and fear finally buckled under the simple weight of mercy. Patricia wept quietly in the corner. Before she left, Refugio stood and turned to him one last time. "I didn't bring the Virgin to convert you, Pastor. I brought her so that if you feel alone, you'd remember that mothers are always praying, even when their children forget how to pray for themselves." Then she smiled, a real smile, not out of victory, but out of peace, and walked out of the room, leaving the scent of rosewater and candles behind her. That night, Matthew didn't cry out to heaven. He didn't beg for healing. Instead, he whispered 2 words into the silence. "Thank you." No one knew whether it was to Refugio or the Virgin, or maybe even to God himself. But for the first time in months, he slept without pain. Something shifted after the visit. Refugio Mendoza's quiet presence had left more than a framed image on the bedside table. It left a silence. Not the kind that isolates, but the kind that softens. For days, Reverend Matthew Blake said little. He didn't ask for the latest lab results. He didn't request more medication. Instead, he asked for a notebook. Patricia brought him one, leather-bound with a ballpoint pen tucked inside the spine. "What's it for?" she asked. Matthew looked at her, his voice thin but steady. "For things I should have said years ago." And so, with trembling hands and a morphine haze clouding the edges of his thoughts, he began to write. The first letter was to Roberto Mendoza. "Roberto, I once told you that loving Christ meant destroying what your mother cherished. I called it courage. I see now it was pride. A real man doesn't have to choose between faith and family. I made you believe you did. For that, I beg your forgiveness." He folded the note, handed it to Patricia. "Make sure it gets to him." The second was to his congregation. That one took longer. He stared at the blank page for over an hour, as if the very weight of 20 years of sermons, baptisms, and conversions pressed down on the paper. Finally, he began. "To my brothers and sisters in Christ, I once taught you that purity of doctrine required the rejection of others. I mistook zeal for truth. In trying to defend Christ, I forgot how he loved. If I ever made you feel that hating Catholics was faithfulness, I was wrong, completely. Christ doesn't need us to divide. He died to unite." He signed it simply. "Pastor Matthew, a sinner saved by grace." Patricia posted it to the church bulletin. By sunset, it had been shared 8,000 times. Some followers were shocked. Some were angry. Others, like Carmen Velasquez, wept. "He's still my pastor," she told the local paper, "but now he's also my brother." The last letter was the hardest. It wasn't addressed to the living. "Abuela Celia, they say the dead don't read letters, but if your soul is anywhere near heaven, maybe you'll hear this. I broke your altar. I mocked your prayers. I thought your faith was weakness, but you had something I lost trying to be right all the time. Peace." The ink smudged where the pen paused. "If you ever see the lady in blue stars, the one you whispered to through tears, Tell her that the boy who spat at her finally understands what it means to be held by grace. Patricia placed that letter in the small wooden Bible box they kept at home, the one Celia had once used for prayer cards. Word of Matthew's letters spread far beyond Corpus Christi. A local Catholic radio host read them aloud on air. A pastor from El Paso reached out to share them with his congregation. Even Father Anthony Delgado, the longtime Catholic priest Matthew had once publicly debated, called Patricia with a request. "May I visit him?" When he arrived, the two men, once rivals in theology, spoke not as opponents, but as two weary travelers, both scarred by years of spiritual warfare. "I was too proud to listen," Matthew admitted. "I was too quick to judge," Father Delgado replied. Before he left, the priest took Matthew's hand. "Pastor," he said, "maybe God didn't allow this illness to punish you, but to let the walls fall down." Matthew smiled through pale lips. "Then let's not rebuild them." In the weeks that followed, the notebook remained beside him, filling slowly with thoughts, names, and prayers. He didn't call them confessions. He called them repairs. And one by one, bridges that had once been burned were quietly rebuilt, not with sermons, but with humility, ink, and the simple phrase he had rarely used from the pulpit: "I was wrong." No one expected the video to go viral. It was recorded on a Tuesday afternoon in a quiet hospital room. A nurse named Angela Brooks set up the tripod. Patricia pressed record. On the edge of the frame stood Father Anthony Delgado, dressed simply in a black shirt and collar, and lying in the bed surrounded by IV lines and the constant hum of monitors was Reverend Matthew Blake, barely a shadow of the man he once was. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "To the members of True Faith Revival, and to the faithful of St. Rosa de Lima Parish, for years I preached division in the name of truth. I see now I mistook volume for conviction. In doing so, I hurt good people, faithful people, people who love God in a way different from me. I was wrong." Father Delgado then stepped forward. "As a Catholic priest, I too carried resentment. I allowed anger to cloud compassion. We both believed we were defending God when, in fact, we were defending ourselves." The two men looked at one another, not with rivalry, but with the quiet recognition of shared wounds. "Today," Matthew said, "we lay down our swords, not because doctrine doesn't matter, but because love matters more. And if Christ prayed that we be one, who are we to pray for anything less?" They ended the message in prayer together, not as Protestant and Catholic, but as sons of the same Father. The video was posted to both churches' social media pages that evening. By midnight, it had been shared over 100,000 times. By the end of the week, national religious outlets had picked it up. "A pastor's dying wish, unity," headlined one article. "Two faiths, one forgiveness," read another. But the real transformation didn't happen online. It happened in Corpus Christi. The following Sunday, something extraordinary occurred at St. Rosa de Lima during the 10 a.m. Mass. A group of visitors quietly entered through the side doors. Men in jeans and women in plain skirts, some clutching Bibles, others carrying nothing but uncertain smiles. They were members of True Faith Revival. At the same moment across town, a group of elderly Catholic women in lace veils walked into the back pews of True Faith's warehouse church. No one said anything at first. Then someone stood up and crossed the aisle. A young man named Roberto Mendoza, once a poster child for Matthew's evangelical fire, now trembling in front of his childhood parish priest. "I want to ask forgiveness," he said, his voice shaking, "to my mother, to my neighbors, to Mary, whom I judged without knowing her story." From the other side of the room, Doña Refugio stepped forward, her eyes wet with tears. "I never stopped praying for you, mijo," she whispered, "even when you hated what I loved." They embraced, and in that simple moment, walls crumbled. For weeks, both congregations continued crossing thresholds they never thought they would: joint food drives, prayer walks, vigils for the sick. Children from both churches played together in the same dusty parks where once their parents avoided eye contact. Even the mayor of Corpus Christi issued a statement, calling it an unprecedented example of spiritual reconciliation in modern America. What no one could deny was this: it started with a man who had once spat at a sacred image and ended with him kneeling beside it. At his funeral, held in the high school auditorium, a neutral ground. There were no banners, no denominational flags, just a simple wooden cross, and beneath it a table. On that table, a worn Bible, a rosary, and a letter with a handwritten title, Things I Got Wrong and What They Taught Me. The auditorium was filled to capacity. Protestants and Catholics sang together, cried together, prayed together. And as the final hymn rang out, Amazing Grace, sung in both English and Spanish, no one asked who believed what. They only asked, how can we keep this going? It was November, Dia de los Muertos, when Reverend Matthew Blake woke just before dawn. The hospital room was silent save for the soft beep of the heart monitor and the distant echo of church bells ringing across Corpus Christi. Outside, marigolds lined the sidewalks. Inside, his breath came slowly, measured, fragile, but his eyes were clear. Patricia sat beside him, dozing in the chair with her Bible open on her lap. When he stirred, she woke instantly. Matt, she whispered, taking his hand. I'm still here, he smiled faintly, but not for long. There was no fear in his voice, no trembling, only peace. For the first time in months, the pain had lifted, not because of the morphine, but because something in his soul had quieted. The war he had waged for decades had ended, and this time he had surrendered. At 6:30 a.m., Father Anthony arrived. He had come each morning since the reconciliation video, sometimes just to sit, sometimes to pray. But this morning felt different. Patricia opened the door and simply nodded. Inside, Matthew looked up and offered a weak grin. You came? He rasped. I told you I'd be here at the finish line. Father Anthony took a seat beside the bed. They didn't speak for several minutes. They didn't need to. Then Matthew turned slightly toward the small framed image of the Virgin of Guadalupe still resting on his nightstand. Worn, faded, the same one Refugio Mendoza had left behind. I used to call her a myth, he whispered. Anthony said nothing. But I think, Matthew continued, his eyes moist, I think she prayed for me anyway. He turned his gaze to the ceiling. A shaft of sunlight streamed through the half-open blinds and lit his face with a soft, golden hue. Do you believe, he asked, barely audible now, that a mother ever stops praying for her children? No, Father Anthony answered gently. Not even once. Matthew nodded. His lips moved slow and careful. Virgencita, take me to your son. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He died at 6:47 a.m., just as the sun rose over the rooftops and the Catholic bells met the soft strains of gospel hymns drifting from True Faith Revival across town. The timing was unplanned. The harmony was undeniable. The funeral took place 4 days later in the Corpus Christi High School auditorium, a space big enough for what had become a citywide act of healing. There was no pulpit, only a wooden platform. No denominational emblems, only two objects side by side, a Bible cracked at the spine and a rosary gently coiled beside it. The service was led jointly by Father Anthony and Pastor Elena Torres, Matthew's longtime associate minister. They spoke not of doctrine, but of redemption, not of victory, but of peace. Carmen Velázquez sang an Ave Maria in Spanish. Then a young Catholic choir followed with Amazing Grace. The auditorium filled with both laughter and tears, but the moment that no one forgot happened just after the final blessing. Roberto Mendoza, standing beside his mother, stepped forward and held up a letter. It's the one Pastor Blake wrote me, he said. The one where he said, loving Christ never meant hurting the people who love you. Then he turned to his mother and whispered, Gracias por no rendirte. Thank you for not giving up on me. She took his hand, and together they laid the letter beneath the cross at the front of the stage. Later that night, as candles were lit across altars and driveways for Dia de los Muertos, someone placed a single white rose beneath the statue of the Virgin outside St. Rosa de Lima. Taped beside it was a torn piece of notebook paper. It read, I spent years shouting to God through a megaphone, but in the end I only heard him when I listened through a mother's prayer. Matthew Blake. In life, he was known as the man who spat at the Virgin. In death, he became the man who finally understood her silence, and in that silence, found peace. Months passed. The hospital bed was gone. The flowers had withered. But the story, his story, refused to fade. In Corpus Christi, Something had taken root that couldn't be explained by theology or tradition, something that neither seminary nor sanctuary had ever quite achieved. A softening. Two churches, once defined by tension, now held monthly joint vigils. Children who had once been told they're not like us now prayed hand in hand. The local food bank overflowed each weekend with volunteers wearing both crucifixes and Jesus Saves shirts. It wasn't perfect. Old wounds take time. But the dividing line had been blurred by something no debate could destroy: compassion. In a back office at True Faith Revival, tucked between sermon archives and boxes of outdated flyers, a leather-bound notebook sat on display, the one Reverend Matthew Blake had filled in his final weeks. Visitors still came to see it. They didn't always cry. Sometimes they smiled, especially at the last page. If I had to preach one last sermon, it wouldn't be about Mary or theology or getting the gospel perfectly right. It would be about sitting across from someone you once called wrong and listening anyway. Because in the end, it wasn't doctrine that saved me. It was mercy. No name, just a shaky signature at the bottom. Refugio Mendoza now led a small interfaith prayer circle out of her living room each Wednesday. One night, when asked why she kept attending, even with Protestants, she simply said, "Because Matthew taught me something no priest ever did." "What's that?" a young woman asked. "That sometimes," she smiled, "the greatest act of faith is forgiving someone who thinks you're lost." Father Anthony Delgado continued serving at St. Rosa de Lima, but his sermons had changed: less fire, more grace. He still quoted scripture, but now he paired it with questions like, "Have you listened to someone who believes differently than you, without planning your rebuttal?" And at the end of each Mass, just before the final blessing, he would often say, "Let's not just be right, let's be kind." Even the younger generation felt it. Roberto Mendoza, once a fiery street preacher, now studied pastoral counseling at a seminary in San Antonio. "I used to think truth was something you shouted," he told his classmates. "But Pastor Blake showed me it's also something you whisper into someone's suffering." He keeps the letter Matthew wrote him folded inside his Bible. It's yellowing now, but the words haven't lost power. And somewhere in a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, beneath a modest headstone that reads simply, "Matthew Blake, 1960 to 2014. Grace found me when pride let go." There's a statue nearby. Not of Christ, as many might expect, but of Mary. Simple, peaceful, no inscription. Just her hands folded in prayer. And every now and then, someone places a white rose at her feet. No one knows who, but many believe it's someone who once stood on the other side of belief and finally crossed over to understanding. What Matthew left behind wasn't a church movement or a theology trend. It was something quieter, something stronger, a truth older than division and bigger than doctrine. That love, real, sacrificial, patient love, heals more than any argument ever could. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up with a rosary in one hand and a Bible in the other and says, "Let's walk together." If this story touched you, if you believe like Matthew came to believe that love is stronger than what separates us, subscribe for more stories of redemption, healing, and unexpected grace. Because sometimes the most powerful sermons are lived, not preached. Did you ever experience a miracle? Let us know in the comments and make sure to subscribe.